What replaced parental instinct didn't arrive with warning labels. It came through hospital corridors, through waiting rooms with pastel walls and educational posters, through the voices of people wearing white coats and institutional badges, through pamphlets placed carefully on reception desks, their pages smooth and newly printed, filled with charts and recommendations that looked like science. By the mid-1970s, the advice had already changed. What grandmothers knew, what mothers had done for thousands of years, was now being rewritten. Not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily, through channels that carried authority. Pediatricians began handing out feeding schedules. Nurses distributed formula samples in maternity wards. Health organizations published guidelines that traveled from medical journals into family kitchens without most people noticing the route they took. The language was always gentle, always reassuring. Modern mothers can now. Science has shown that. For babies' optimal development, these weren't framed as corrections. They were framed as improvements, as evolution, as care. And most people accepted them because refusing felt like refusing progress itself. The formula arrived in cans with detailed instructions, measured scoops, precise water temperatures, sterilization protocols. It transformed feeding into a technical procedure, something that required following steps, reading labels, consulting references. Where nursing had been instinctive, formula demanded literacy, numeracy, equipment, access to clean water and reliable heat sources, and storage space and purchasing power. But these requirements were rarely mentioned in the promotional materials. Instead, the message was freedom, convenience, shared responsibility. Fathers could feed, mothers could work, babies could be fed on predictable schedules rather than on demand. The narrative was always about what this enabled, never about what it replaced or what it required.
The shift happened in hospitals first. Newborns were taken to nurseries. Bottles were introduced within hours of birth. Supplementation became standard protocol, often before a mother had even attempted to nurse. Staff explained this was normal, that it helped babies maintain blood sugar, that it prevented jaundice, that it gave mothers time to rest and recover. These explanations weren't lies. They were partial truths, selected carefully, emphasizing benefit while obscuring pattern. What wasn't mentioned was how quickly supplementation could interfere with milk production, how formula introduction in the first days created a dependence that became self-reinforcing, how separating mothers from newborns disrupted hormonal cascades that had evolved over millions of years, how convenience for hospital staff scheduling was often prioritized over biological processes that didn't follow institutional timetables. The information traveled through networks that looked neutral. Parent magazines ran articles sponsored by formula companies, though the sponsorship was mentioned in small print nobody read. Parenting classes were taught by representatives from companies that sold feeding products. Free samples arrived in the mail, precisely timed to the moments when breastfeeding was statistically most likely to face challenges, around 2 weeks, around 6 weeks, around 3 months. This timing wasn't accidental. Most people didn't question it. The sources seemed credible. The intentions seemed good. The products were sold in pharmacies, recommended by medical professionals, used by neighbors and friends and relatives. Choosing formula didn't feel like a choice against something. It felt like participating in modernity, like being a responsible parent who followed expert guidance. The advertising was sophisticated. It showed calm mothers and thriving babies. It emphasized science, pictures of laboratory equipment, white-coated researchers, chemical formulas printed on packaging. It borrowed the visual language of medicine and applied it to commerce. The boundary between healthcare recommendation and product marketing was deliberately blurred until most consumers couldn't identify where one ended and the other began.
And beneath all of this, there was something else operating. something that went mostly undiscussed. Most people never noticed this at the time, how the shift toward formula happened to align almost perfectly with women's increasing participation in workplaces that offered no accommodation for nursing mothers. How the same decades that saw formula use rise dramatically were the same decades that saw women's labor force participation increase without corresponding changes to workplace policy, childcare infrastructure, or family leave provisions. The market presented a solution to a problem it had helped create. Women were needed in the workforce. The economy required their labor. But the systems built to employ them assumed their bodies wouldn't interfere with productivity. Breastfeeding interfered. It required breaks, privacy, flexibility. It made women unavailable in ways that were difficult to schedule around. Formula made women available. It allowed them to leave their infants with caregivers for 8, 10, 12-hour shifts. It made motherhood and employment logistically compatible without anyone having to redesign employment. So the advice changed, not through conspiracy, not through single decisions made in closed rooms, but through thousands of small adjustments made by people responding rationally to the incentives their environment created. Hospitals needed efficiency. Employers needed reliability. Corporations needed markets. Medical professionals needed guidelines they could standardize and scale. And parents needed sleep, needed certainty, needed to believe they were doing the right thing. Formula provided all of these needs an answer that fit. The real impact appeared years later, not in ways that could be traced back to single causes, not in obvious direct lines, but in patterns, in population-level shifts that were only visible when you stepped back far enough to see the shape of them. Rates of certain conditions began changing. Allergies increased. Autoimmune disorders increased. Obesity patterns shifted. Microbiome diversity decreased. These were complex phenomena with multiple contributing factors, and isolating any single cause was nearly impossible. But researchers began noticing correlations. Formula-fed infants showed different gut bacteria colonization patterns, different immune responses, different metabolic markers. The differences were often small at individual level, but across millions of children, small differences aggregated into measurable population changes. By then, though, the system was fully established. Formula companies were multi-billion-dollar industries with marketing budgets larger than public health agencies' entire operating funds. Hospitals had structured their maternity wards around bottle-feeding logistics. Workplaces had built employment practices assuming mothers wouldn't breastfeed. Housing was designed without private space for nursing. Public facilities rarely provided accommodation. Child care centers required bottles, not breasts. The infrastructure had been built, and infrastructure, once established, resists change, even when the reasoning behind it becomes questionable. What made this particularly difficult to discuss was how personal it felt. Parents had made decisions based on the best information available to them. They had trusted authorities they had been taught to trust. They had done what seemed right with the resources and circumstances they had. Suggesting those decisions might have been influenced by forces beyond their awareness, by systemic pressures rather than free choice, by corporate strategies rather than pure medical guidance, that felt like accusation. So the conversation rarely happened. Instead, the topic became surrounded by defensiveness, by judgment, by competing claims about what constituted good parenting. The discussion got trapped in individual choice rhetoric, which made it nearly impossible to examine the structural conditions that had shaped those choices. Formula companies continued advertising. Hospitals continued their protocols. Workplaces continued their policies, and a generation grew up assuming this was how things had always been, that formula was simply a modern invention that improved on nature, that the shift away from breastfeeding had been driven by women's preferences rather than economic restructuring and commercial interest. The historical context was slowly forgotten. By the 1990s, public health organizations began cautiously recommending breastfeeding again. They called it "breast is best," a slogan that managed to both affirm breastfeeding's benefits and subtly imply that formula was a close second. The guidance acknowledged that exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months was ideal, but immediately followed this with multiple caveats about when formula was necessary, appropriate, or acceptable. The messaging was careful, too careful. It bent over backward to avoid making formula-feeding mothers feel judged, which was compassionate on individual level, but made it nearly impossible to clearly articulate what had actually happened on systemic level. Because what had happened wasn't that some mothers chose formula and others chose breastfeeding. What had happened was that an entire society had restructured itself in ways that made one option logistically simple and the other logistically complex, that had made one option economically supported and the other economically penalized, that had made one option culturally normalized and the other culturally suspect. And then, having created these structural conditions, the society told mothers the choice was theirs. Some people reading this might remember being told that breast and bottle were essentially equivalent, that fed is best, that what mattered was mother's comfort and baby's nutrition, and either method accomplished both. They might remember feeling relieved by this message, freed by it, given permission to do what circumstances seemed to require without guilt. The message was kind, but kindness and truth are not always the same thing. When economic systems need populations to behave certain ways, they don't usually mandate behavior directly. That would create resistance. Instead, they adjust conditions until the desired behavior becomes the path of least resistance. Then they attribute the resulting choices to individual preference. This pattern didn't originate with infant feeding. It appears across multiple domains where bodily autonomy encounters economic requirement, where biological processes meet institutional logistics, where what bodies naturally do conflicts with what systems need them to do. The formula situation was part of a broader renegotiation of how human reproduction would fit into industrial and post-industrial economic organization. It wasn't resolved in favor of reproduction. Women were needed as workers. Infants were needed as consumers. But the messy biological reality of how infant humans actually feed, how often, how unpredictably, how tied to maternal presence, that didn't fit into the systems being built. So the solution was to engineer the biology out, to replace it with a product that could be purchased, scheduled, delegated, and controlled. This was presented as liberation, and in certain specific ways, for certain specific women, it was. But liberation that requires purchasing products from corporations, that requires your body to conform to workplace schedules, that requires you to override biological signals in favor of institutional timing, that's a particular kind of liberation, the kind that's profitable to provide. None of this required conspiracy. It didn't require villains. It just required thousands of people in institutions making reasonable decisions according to the logic their positions required. Pediatricians wanted standardizable guidelines. Hospital administrators needed efficient patient flow. Formula company executives needed market growth. Employers needed reliable workers. Each made rational choices within their domain. The problem was that nobody was making decisions from the perspective of what intact mother-infant biology actually required. That perspective had no institutional representation, no budget, no lobby. It existed diffusely in midwives and lactation consultants and anthropologists and evolutionary biologists, but these groups had no coordinated power. They couldn't compete with medical associations and corporate marketing and economic necessity. So the advice that shaped millions of feeding decisions came from sources with other priorities. And the consequences unfolded slowly enough that causation was always deniable, always debatable, always complicated by other variables, which meant the system that created the conditions never had to acknowledge responsibility or make repair. It simply moved forward, continued operating, normalized what it had created. By the time many people realized something might have been wrong, their own children were grown. The decisions were decades past. Revisiting them felt pointless, painful, like picking at wounds that had scarred over. So most people didn't. They accepted the narrative they'd been given. They defended the choices they'd made. They passed similar advice to the next generation. The cycle continued. What makes this worth examining isn't to create guilt. Guilt is individual and backward-looking. What makes this worth examining is that the pattern is still operating. Different products, different guidelines, different systems, but the same underlying dynamic: economic and institutional needs reshaping biological and social realities, then presenting the resulting conditions as natural, inevitable, or freely chosen. Understanding one instance helps recognize the pattern elsewhere. The formula shift demonstrated how quickly populations can be moved away from ancestral practices when those practices conflict with industrial organization. How effectively marketing can be wrapped in medical authority. How completely structural coercion can be disguised as individual choice. How thoroughly history can be rewritten within a single generation. These weren't unique capabilities. They were tools, templates, methods that proved effective and were therefore applied elsewhere to other aspects of how bodies and families and communities organize themselves. The same decades that saw formula become normalized saw similar shifts in birth practices, childhood education, food production, medical care, community structure, and family formation, each presented as progress, each following similar patterns, each producing similar disconnects between what was recommended and what human biology or social cohesion actually required, and each leaving populations with a vague sense that something was wrong, but difficulty identifying exactly what or why. That difficulty wasn't accidental. Systems that benefit from populations accepting their conditions have strong incentive to make those conditions seem natural or inevitable, to make alternatives seem unrealistic or backwards, to make questioning seem like denialism or nostalgia. The formula industry built a highly successful model for this kind of reality construction. What replaced trust in maternal bodies was trust in institutional systems, and those systems optimized for goals those bodies didn't share. Similar decisions followed.